Now, Bjarte Bogsnes is a pioneer in the beyond budgeting movement. He has a very long international career, and as we know, most of the attendants, actually the participants, know him already. He's a long career in finance and in HR. Bjarte is also the chairman of the Beyond Budgeting Roundtable, and I'm also very happy to welcome here Sebastian, who's also on the board of Beyond Budgeting. So great you are here, Sebastian. And Bjarte is also an international and well-known business speaker and a winner of the Harvard Business Review Innovation Award. So what he has done so far is also helped numerous companies globally on their beyond budgeting journeys. And the number of the well-known companies is actually increasing. So it's, for example, leading the implementation of beyond budgeting at Statoil, which is now Equinor, one of the largest or the largest Norwegian company. Maybe Scandinavian company, yeah. And you also now serve as a senior advisor for the performance framework there. And prior to that, you led a similar initiative at Borealis in the mid-90s. And Borealis is obviously also one of the companies that inspired the whole beyond budgeting model. So we will have roughly 40 minutes presentation, and then afterwards, we're going to go to the Q&A. So if you have questions, please be so kind and ask them into the chat. Just put them into the chat. And after Bjarte's presentation, we're going to dig them out of the chat room, and then Simone, Rainer, and or I, we will just present them so we can actually get the answers. And just wondering now, is anything else I should have said right now? Obviously not. So then I would really like you to welcome with me Bjarte Bogsnes with his Beyond Budgeting workshop. And Bjarte, the screen is yours. Go ahead.
Thank you. And if I can just give you one update on my bio, I actually left with a heavy heart Equinor and corporate life a couple of years ago to be able to work full-time on beyond budgeting through Bogsnes Advisory. So that's where I am today. Yeah. All right, let me share my screen. So can you see my screen?
Excellent, yes.
Very good. Right. So beyond budgeting, I'm going to start out a little bit philosophical here, and then I'm going to make this more and more concrete. So I will kind of end up being very practical on how to get started, but we need to start out in a different place so that we are clear on the philosophy behind here. And every time I discuss beyond budgeting with executives, finance people, managers, others, there's one word that keeps coming up over and over again, and that word is control. And you understand the context and why. It is about the fear of losing control. When I hear this, I often ask these people, what do you mean with control? What are you so, please explain to me what you're so afraid of losing. And after people have said cost control, actually many go quiet. They struggle with defining what they are so afraid of losing, which is interesting. So I checked up in Oxford Dictionary, how do they define control? And they call it the power to influence or direct people's behavior or the course of events. And what does this mean in organizational terms, in business terms? Well, it basically means two things, controlling people and controlling the future. And behind these two lies the two main assumptions behind traditional management. Number one, you can't trust people. Number two, the future is predictable and plannable. And these are the assumptions that we challenge in Beyond Budgeting, because this is not true, as you will know. Of course, you can manage people, but if people are managed in stupid ways, they hopefully will find a way around in order to get the work done. And when it comes to the future, the only thing we know is that we don't know. Talking about people, trusting people, I always traveled a lot. And the first thing I always check when I come into the hotel room at night is what kind of clothing hangers do they have? Is it the one at the top, or is it the stupid one at the bottom, which is a hassle to use? And how come some hotels offer us these stupid hangers at the bottom? And I think we all know why. It is about the few stolen hangers with a hook. And what was the response? To punish everybody because somebody did something wrong. Actually, one of the many problems with traditional management. Wise people out there have very much agreed with what I just have said. Good old Peter Drucker, most of what we call management is about making it difficult for people to do their job. And when it comes to predicting the future, planning, corporate planning, another wise person, Russell Acuff, he compared a lot of the planning he was observing in big organizations. He compared it with a ritual rain dance. It has no effect on the weather, but those who engage in it think it does. And I can relate to what Mr. Acuff is saying here, because I have done a lot of dancing in my life. My first management job in Equinor, or called Statoil back then, after graduating from business school, was head of the corporate budget department. So I've been heading up more budget processes than I want to be reminded about. The dancing was great, but I don't think it had really had a big effect on the performance of the organization. And to the extent it had, that effect was probably more negative than positive. Okay, so much for wise people. Imagine an organization that 100 years ago invented a fantastic machine. It was state-of-the-art and key for the success of this organization. 50 years ago, this machine started to make some trouble, and today the thing is completely broken. It looked like this. This is not a true story, because in real life, people would hopefully have done something 50 years ago. Either try to fix the machine, or even better, try to invent a new and better machine, because innovation is something we all love, right? Innovation is great. We all want to be leading edge, unique, right there in the forefront, better than everybody else. But that enthusiasm for innovation seems to be limited to technology innovation, into product services and so on. But there is also something called management innovation that we shall talk about today. And management innovation, is that great? Oh no, that is scary. Kicking out the budget, are you crazy? The consequence of this is that it's very crowded on the left-hand side because everybody is into that innovation in some form or shape. Management innovation is not yet a crowded place because it feels scary. But this is actually good news for brave companies who dare to explore and embrace also this kind of innovation, because you can get just as much performance from management innovation as you can get from technology innovation. And there are companies out there who openly state that we have no advantage whatsoever in what we produce, sell, provide. We find it in the way we lead and manage. And I've got an example for you a little bit later. So it's all about performance. That is why we should go beyond budgeting, because it is good for performance defined in the right way. So I will come back to that, that important topic of performance. But before that, it is still called beyond budgeting. It has something to do with budgets and solving budget problems as well. So I'd like to share with you my budget problem list, which is quite long, by the way. It's a very time-consuming process, making budgets, following up budgets, assumptions quickly outdated. This is a serious problem. Budgeting can stimulate what I would call unethical behaviors. The lowballing, the gaming, the sandbagging, the resource hoarding, the frenzied December spending. These are not the behaviors we would like to see between colleagues, right? At the same time, I'm not blaming anyone for behaving like this, because people are just responding to the system we have designed for them to operate in. So if we want to change behaviors, right, it is not about fixing people, it's about fixing systems, as you well know. That changes behavior. And that is what beyond budgeting does. It can create these illusions of control that we talked about. Budgets force us to make decisions too early, right? We have to decide in the autumn, the year before, what we shall do next year and what it shall cost. And in larger organizations, too many of these decisions are typically taken too high up. doesn't always improve the quality of these decisions. Sometimes it's very often the other way around. Budgets can prevent us from doing stuff we should have done, but we can't because it's not in the budget. But this also works the other way around sometimes. Maybe it can lead us to do things that we shouldn't have done, but it is in the budget and it is spend it or lose it. You know the game. And linked to this, I fully accept that the cost budget can be a very effective ceiling on cost, but that is just half the story, because that ceiling is just as effective as a floor in the sense that these budgets tend to be spent, cost budgets tend to be spent for the reasons we just talked about. And to define good performance as hitting the budget numbers is a very narrow, mechanical, and sometimes a completely outdated way of defining performance. We need a richer and broader and more intelligent way of talking about performance. Now, are there any of these problems that you haven't experienced in your own career and your own work life? And I can't see all of you, but I wouldn't be surprised if there are no hands up. Because my experience is that, because I've been sharing this slide with hundreds of thousands of people around the world in the almost 30 years I've been working with Beyond Budgeting, and almost everybody out there agree. A lot of nodding heads and guilty smiles when this slide is coming up. At the same time, the big majority of companies still continue doing this stuff, even if that is changing these days, as we will come back to. And I have, that's interesting, I have a theory about why. But before that, I'd like to add on one more problem that very few actually have on their list. I've called it conflicting purposes. I'll come back to that problem. It's an interesting problem because it is a problem, but it also represents solutions to many of these other problems. But again, how come so many continue with stuff, doing stuff they do admit is quite stupid? One reason could be that the problems are recognized, but these problems are regarded more as irritating itches and not symptoms of a bigger, deeper, more serious problem. But that is exactly what these problems are, symptoms of a huge problem, which is also a paradox. Because what we are, first of all, what we are looking at here is quite an old management technology. Budgeting was invented roughly 100 years ago by Mr. James O. McKinsey. I never met Mr. McKinsey, but actually I don't think he was an evil man. I actually don't think he didn't have any bad intentions. His intentions were good. He wanted to help organizations perform better. This was management innovation 100 years ago, and I'm sure it worked pretty well. Maybe even 50 years ago, but no longer today. Because today, this way of leading, this way of managing, this way of thinking is doing exactly the opposite. It has become more of a barrier than a support for getting out the best possible performance in organizations. And that, my friends, I would call a pretty big problem. So we are back to this important word, performance. And some of you know that I have a metaphor I like to use when I talk about performance. And we're going to move from organizations into traffic, because in traffic, when we are out driving, we would also like to experience good performance. And for me, that would be a safe and good flow. I simply hate traffic jams. And by the way, I don't know why it's called the rush hour. There's no rush at all. Those cars are standing dead still. But anyway, there's a lot of stuff I don't understand. Anyway, I think traffic authorities, they want the same. And this is something you often meet when there is crossing traffic. And this light, by the way, has no sensors, okay? 2 questions here. And the one who is in control here, who makes decisions about when you can drive, when you have to stop, that is, of course, the person who programmed this light, the programmer. And where would this person be as you sit there waiting for that green light? Well, somewhere else. I never checked, but I don't think there was anybody sitting inside that pole. And the information this programming would be based on, that would be some historical trends, maybe some forecasts, but for obvious reasons, not entirely fresh information. So here is a management model where the manager actually is absent and decisions are based on somewhat outdated information. Fortunately, there is an alternative, a very different solution with exactly the same purpose, the roundabout. Same questions, very different answers. Because here we make decisions as drivers about when to stop and when to drive, and the information we use to take these decisions, that is fresh real-time information. So very different answers. Could be interesting to compare these two ways of managing. So let's do that. And I've got a few leading questions for you here. It's actually proven scientifically that the roundabout is not just more efficient, but it's also safer, and actually lifetime cycle cost is lower than with the traffic lights. And of course, it has a lot to do with that people in this situation have the autonomy to make decisions based on fresh information. But there are two other, but we also know that it takes more competence to drive in a roundabout compared to relating to a traffic light. And going back to our organizations, everything we need to leave behind of traditional management is in many ways much easier than what we need to move towards. I mean, this stuff is not necessarily easier. It takes more leadership, not just from leaders, but it's also so much more fun, so much more rewarding, so much more fulfilling, and so much more value adding. I don't think you will find many people in Equinor, for instance, wanting to go back to the traditional budgeting that we left behind almost 20 years ago. But it's not enough with fresh information and the authority to act on it. We also need a positive value set. Because if there is a value set, a mindset among drivers waiting for that green light, which is about me first, I don't care about the rest, that mindset is normally not a big problem in front of that light. But in the roundabout, me first, don't care about the rest, can be a big problem. Because here we are much more dependent on everybody involved kind of sharing this positive common purpose or wish of wanting this to flow well. We have to help each other. We have to interact with each other in a very different way than what we need to do in front of that light. Two other important words here. Trust is obviously one. In front of that light, we are not trusted. In the roundabout, we are. Transparency is also an important word here. Not that important in front of the light. As long as you can see the color of the light, you can make your decision. In the roundabout, you need full transparency. You need to understand and see the whole situation to make your decision. The roundabout is a more self-regulating way of managing. And today, organizations need more self-regulating management models for at least two reasons. The first reason is external. It has to do with our VUCA environment. A lot more volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity today compared to when I started my budget and planning career in the early 80s. And if we take that VUCA level seriously, it must have implications for how we design our management models. The other reflection or reality we need to reflect on is not external, it's internal. It has to do with people, employees, asking ourselves, what kind of employees do we generally believe we have in the organization? Do we believe that most of them is in the kind of negative theory X camp and must be kind of heavily directed and controlled and managed? Or do we believe that the majority is in the theory Y camp, where people actually want to do a good job, want to be involved, want to be listened to, want to be treated as adults? And again, we don't need to agree on where our sympathy lies with theory X or theory Y, even if I have a certain hope. But it should be very easy to agree that if we mainly have a theory X view on employees, our management model should look very different compared to if we mainly have a theory Y view. If we then combine these two dimensions, it could look like this. And traditional management here lies in this lower left-hand corner with a conscious or unconscious assumption, as we talked about, that you can't trust more people and that the future is predictable and plannable. If we disagree with this, then this is not the place to be. Then we need to move up in that upper right-hand corner by addressing both leadership horizontally and our own management processes vertically. And what we need to get out of traditional management, I've used the following words to describe. And again, maybe there was a time when this was the right thing to do, but that is a long time ago in most places in the world, I would argue. So what do we need to do? A few headlines in both dimensions. On the leadership side, more purpose and values-based, less rules-based. We are not saying no rules. we are saying less and more. More autonomy for the reasons we just have talked about, more transparency. And in this context, transparency is good news for scared managers, afraid of losing control, because transparency can actually be quite an effective control mechanism, a social control mechanism. And let me give you a very concrete example. This is from the Swiss pharmaceutical company, Roche, which today is on a beyond budgeting journey. But some years ago, they did a very interesting experiment around travel cost. In a pilot, they kicked out the travel budget, almost all travel rules and regulations, replaced this with full transparency. So with a few exceptions, everybody could see everything. If you travel, to where did you fly, sleep, eat, cheap or expensive? Open for your colleagues to see, and vice versa. And guess what happened with travel cost in that pilot? Came down through a very simple self-regulating control mechanism, right? This was about tearing out pages in the rules book instead of doing the opposite. But there is a but here. Transparency is a very powerful mechanism. It has to be applied with wisdom. And if it becomes naming and shaming, it doesn't work. That is why we should always position transparency more from a learning perspective than from a control perspective. I mean, how can we learn from each other if everything is secret? And last but not least, internal intrinsic motivation as opposed to extrinsic external motivation. And of course, the most common way of motivating people extrinsically in business today, and increasingly also in the public sector, is individual bonus. And I can think of no area where there's a bigger gap between what most research is telling us about motivation and what most businesses is practicing. It's quite fascinating. So our beyond recommendation and beyond budgeting, as I will come back to, is go for common bonus schemes, for instance, driven by how the company is doing versus competition, and skip those individual bonuses who make so much damage in so many different ways. A lot of companies, a lot of organizations, they have the very best intentions on the people and leadership side. If you look at what they write, if you look at what they say, it's good, great stuff. But it doesn't help to have theory Y leadership intentions if you have theory X management processes, which is the case in so many organizations, creating these poisonous gaps between what we say and what we do. So if we are serious about these words, we have to change our management processes, not just to better reflect these intentions on leadership, but also to make them more VUCA robust. And a few headlines on what that means in practice. First of all, we have to do something with the traditional detailed annual budget, because that represents so much of what we find in that lower left-hand corner. More specifically, when we shall set targets and goals, to the extent we shall do that, that's another separate interesting discussion. But if we do it, could we learn something from football? I have yet to meet the football team stating that the ambition for next season is to score 39 goals and get 42 points. They don't think like that. Those are budget goals. They think in terms of league tables, doing well against others and hopefully better than everybody else. And that relative thinking can actually in some cases also be applied internally in organizations and between organizations to address what is good performance. When it comes to the rhythm, the cadence of all these processes, why shall everything here circulate around the fiscal year of typically January to December? From a pure business point of view, that is very often a completely artificial construct. So where possible, where it makes sense, we need to organize these processes on a more event-driven, business-driven rhythm and less on a calendar-driven rhythm. And last but not least, when we shall evaluate performance, we cannot reduce that to comparing two numbers, actual versus budget, and then conclude. We need a richer, broader performance evaluation. And this is a very high-level introduction to what Beyond Budgeting is about, addressing both leadership and management processes in a coherent, consistent way in order to become more adaptive and more human. That is the kind of high-level introduction. These are the 12 principles and the complete model. I will not go through anything here on this slide in detail. I will come back to some of the stuff on the right-hand side in a minute, but a few reflections on this slide before we move on. First of all, that tagline is important. Performance the right way. Beyond budgeting changes how we define performance, how we deliver performance, how we evaluate performance, and how we reward performance the right way. And as you can see, we address both leadership principles and management processes. But if you look at what we say on the leadership side here, purpose, values, transparency, autonomy, and some examples, I mean, it's not unique. You'll find a number of other communities and models saying very much the same. But very often, these communities, these models have not reflected very much about what kind of management processes are needed to activate these good leadership intentions. And that is why we have this dual focus on beyond budgeting, what we preach on the left-hand side, what we practice on the right-hand side. And there has to be coherence between the two. And a classical example of the opposite that we find in so many organizations. It doesn't help that we talk principle 4 here, loud and warm on autonomy, about how fantastic employees we have on board. And we would be nothing without you. And we trust you so much. But not that much. Of course, we need detailed travel budgets. I mean, this is hypocrisy. And people notice, and the words on the left-hand side become hollow because the management processes have a very different message. And what we do always speaks 10 times louder than what we say. So coherency is key between the two. It's also important with a vertical coherence, especially on between the management processes. As you can see, they start out in finance territory, moves into HR territory, and there has to be a coherent, consistent philosophy behind the two, meaning that this is something that finance and human resources needs to work together in implementing. These are principles. This is not the recipe. So what this should mean in an organization, that depends on that organization's business, culture, history, and that's the way it should be. I don't like management recipes because in a management recipe, somebody has done all the thinking for you. So the only thing you have to do is to buy the books, read them, by the way, hire the consultants, tick the boxes. I find that both boring and dangerous. Some people are frustrated. They want the recipe. And we tell them that, well, maybe you have to go somewhere else. That doesn't mean that we don't have concrete practical recommendations on what this could mean in your organization. We have lots of them. But again, you have to be the one that finds out what is the best way to do this in your organization. A number of companies are today on this journey in some form or shape. This is one of the most busy or dynamic slides I have in my presentation. We keep adding on companies to this list, and I could have talked for hours and hours about amazing management innovation taking place here. We don't have the time. So just a quick few words about one of the pioneers in beyond budgeting. A bank that you might have heard about, Swedish bank. You see them at the top in the middle here, Swedish Handelsbanken. And this was the guy that got it all started. And these are some of the things he said about the budget, by the way. And this is a fascinating bank for many reasons. One reason is that they have no budgets, no targets, no individual bonus. That's interesting, but it doesn't stop here. They have been doing this since 1970, but it doesn't stop here either, because this bank has been performing better than the average of its competitors almost every year since 1972. That is how they define performance, by the way. They think football. A lot of autonomy, a lot of transparency, a lot of comparison, benchmarking, league tables between branches, no targets, a lot of autonomy for these branches to do what is the best thing for the branch to do. And again, a lot of transparency to create learning, to see, I mean, who is performing better than us that we can learn from. A very amazing bank. Some people find the beyond budgeting model and the 12 principles that we just looked at a bit big, a bit scary, a little bit overwhelming, especially finance people, and if you are coming from the agile community, I don't think you will find it scary, but some finance people and some executives do. If so, then we got some good news. We have a very simple, practical, tested, logical place to start out, which later can take you into the bigger beyond budgeting discussions. And it's very much about that last problem I talked about, conflicting purposes. It is about asking a very simple question: why do we budget? And in thinking about that question, don't think just about cost budgets. It's the broader finance definition of budgets, which we talk about: profit and loss budgets, cash flow budgets, balance sheet budgets, the kind of the broad definition. And companies have basically three reasons for making these budgets. The first is that budgets are used to set targets: financial targets, sales targets, production targets. The other purpose of that budget is that it should provide a kind of outlook of what next year could look in terms of profit and cash flow. So it's also a kind of forecast. So that's two purposes: target setting, forecasting. The third purpose is resource allocation. The budget hands out bags of money to the organization on operational cost investments. And it might seem very efficient to solve all three in one process and one set of numbers. But that is also the problem, because what happens when we move into a budget process? And let's assume that upstairs finance, they want to understand what next year could look like in terms of profits. So they ask people responsible on the sales revenue side, what are your best numbers for next year? But everybody knows that what I'm sending upstairs tend to come back to me as a target for next year, and very often with a bonus attached. And trust me, that insight very often does something to the level of numbers submitted, and I think you know which way those numbers are moving before they are sent up. Moving to the cost side, the same people, other people are asked, what are your best numbers for next year? But everybody knows that this is my only shot at getting access to resources for next year. And some might also remember that 20% cut from last year. And again, that insight and that memory might also do something to the level of numbers submitted. And this time they tend to go the other way, namely up. And we might smile a little bit about these behaviors, but this is actually a problem. Not just because it destroys the quality of numbers, but it also stimulates this behavior that we just talked about, that we don't want to see: the lowballing, the gaming, the sandbagging, all that stuff. Again, not blaming anyone behaving like this. It's just a consequence of the system we have designed for this. The good news is that there is a very simple fix to this problem, which is about changing systems, which again changes behavior. And that is about separating these three purposes into three different processes, because these are different things. A target, that is an aspiration, it's what we want to happen. While a forecast is an expectation, it's what we think will happen, whether we like what we see or not. And resource allocation, that is about the optimization of what is often scarce resources. And because we have separated, this can now become different numbers, like a target can be more ambitious than a forecast, which it typically should be. But also we can design different processes here and improve each one in ways impossible when it was all bundled in one process and one set of numbers on the left-hand side. So now we can start to design targets that inspire and stretch people without feeling stretched in a very different and more effective ways than what budget targets does. And thinking relative here can sometimes be the solution. Some companies continue this discussion after some years, moving into skipping targets. Like for instance, Handelsbanken, they have no targets, but the first step is often to improve them. Then we can work on the forecasting, for instance, in getting the bias out of forecasting so that we know we can trust the numbers. And one way to get rid of the bias is to get people to understand that in this model, a forecast is just a forecast. It's not then bid into a target negotiation, because we have a different process for that. It's not an application for resources, because we have a different process for that. It's just a forecast. And also, again, in this model, forecast is not a promise. It's not something you shall deliver on. What we want people to deliver on is targets, if we have them, and we use forecasts to help us deliver by making better decisions. We don't need a million details here. It's forecasting. We are looking at the future, which is very different from looking at the past through accounting, where the decimals and details are sometimes makes more sense and are sometimes required. But we can't bring the accounting mindset with us when we turn around and look to the future. Last but not least, how can we provide better, more intelligent ways of managing cost than what Mr. McKinsey could offer us 100 years ago? And last but not least, how can we now, having separated, how can we organize these, each of the three, on more event-driven, business-driven processes written in, and with a less calendar-driven written? So this is an important slide for at least two reasons. First of all, when people say that it's impossible to operate without a budget, then our response is this slide, which basically says that, well, we still do what that budget tried to do for us, but because we have separated, then we can do each one in much better ways. So if a bank asks for a budget, I mean, they ask for that because they never thought that there was anything else to ask for. But if they are shown this, they can be giving an unbiased forecast, and also if you share your targets and your new and better way you're managing cost, they will be more than happy. The other important thing is that having these improvement discussions, that is a kind of very organic and non-scary way into bigger beyond budgeting discussions. Target setting, what really motivates people. Resource allocation, do we need detailed travel budgets if we say we trust people, and so on and so on. So I have helped, I guess, between 30 or 40 of the companies on that list to get started on their journey over the years. And with most of these companies, this is where we started out. Most of them actually, they get braver along the way. So they keep improving, they keep becoming more radical. But again, this is a very safe place to get started on day one. What most people have questions about here is the third purpose, resource allocation, even if I can respond to questions on the two other ones afterwards, but I will close off with two slides on resource allocation, how to manage cost without a budget, because that's where most questions are coming. Whatever new tools and processes we put in place, they have to be built on a platform of what we call cost consciousness, which very much is about asking different questions than what you typically hear in a budget world. The classical budget question, when you shall do something that costs money, is, do I have a budget for this? And if you have, it's okay. If you don't have, it's not okay. A bit simplified. We want to hear more of the questions on the right-hand side. Is this really necessary? What's good enough? How much value is this creating? And is this within my execution framework? As I will come back to, this is not an anarchy. There are guardrails, but of a different nature than a traditional budget. And these are questions that we should ask on every euro we are spending. And not only in November and December, when the kind of budget bag is almost empty. Hey guys, we have to be cost conscious for 2 months until January 1, because then the bag is full again. I mean, that is meaningless. We have to think like this all the time. In some companies, this mindset combined with some transparency is enough. For larger companies like Equinor, they do need something more. And that more falls into two categories. It's useful to split between projects, investments, and operating costs. And if I take projects, let me again take an example from Equinor. And of course, a project in Equinor is very much steel and concrete and building big stuff. The company invests between 10 and 15 billion US dollars a year. The company has no traditional investment budget where you sit in the autumn the year before and decide everything. Investing exactly this much split on these projects, and then everything is handed out to each project as next year's investment money. That is making decisions too early. Instead, there is a process based on a very simple principle. The bank is always open. meaning that the line can always forward the project for approval at any time. Whether you get a yes or no depends on two things. How good is your project against the criteria the company has, strategic, financial, and others, and can we afford it as things looks today? So this is beyond budgeting's version of continuous delivery, not of software functionality, but of decisions and financial resources. So it's not that difficult when it comes to projects, investments. It's a bit more challenging when it comes to operating cost, but we have very clear recommendations here as well. Here is a menu of different alternatives. What we need to move away from the traditional detailed annual budget for the reasons we just talked about, we need to move towards the right. One alternative is a burn rate guiding. You can spend, there is a constraint in the range of 1,000, 1 million, 10, 100, full autonomy within that constraint. Big difference between the two, the alternative to the left. But sometimes it can be difficult to know, should it be 1,000 or 800, 1,200, then we can move to thinking in relative terms, unit cost constraints. You can spend more if you produce more, 4 euros per unit. But we might make it even more self-regulating. There is no 4 euro per unit, but euro per unit should be competitive versus internal peers, external peers. If you have internal profit centers to fully control all their own revenue side, cost side, if they have a bottom line target, that is also a way of managing cost. That unit cannot run away and spend money like crazy, but it can be okay to spend more if your spending creates value. The last alternative here is nothing at all. No budget, no target. The only numbers in this model, this alternative, is actual cost numbers. We monitor these numbers, and if it looks okay, we do nothing. If it looks a bit strange, we investigate. There might be very good reasons, doses of what we call good cost, value creating cost. But this is important. We might also come across managers who consciously or unconsciously abuse the trust that lies in this model. The further to the right, the more trust we are showing. And the only thing you know if you show trust is in an organization is that someone will abuse it. At Equinor, it has happened, it will happen again. So that's not the issue. The issue is how do we respond? And the simple but wrong response is for a CEO, CFO to say that this trust thing doesn't work. Look what happened here, what happened here. Simple but wrong. The right response is to take that very firm talk with those involved and let it have the necessary consequences. This is not about being soft. It's about not putting everybody in jail because somebody did something wrong. Back to the hotel clothing hangers example. In addition to these constraints, then there are two general guardrails that many companies have in place already. Decision authorities, how big a decision can a manager make before you have to go one level up, nothing to do with budgets. And also spending guidelines, like in Equinor, no travel budget, but on traveling in Europe, then you fly coach, intercontinental, you can fly business. Nothing to do with travel budgets, it just makes it easier for people to make decisions. So that's what I wanted to share with you. That was the very short version of what Beyond Budgeting is about. This is a longer version, a book that then is out in its second edition that has more of everything, problems, more cases, what we did in Borealis, what we did in Statoil/Equinor. There's a chapter about Beyond Budgeting and Agile, and also more about implementation. This book has a kind of normal book length, so it's about 250 pages. That is an issue for a number of executives with limited time to read, right? They struggle with finding time to read thick books. So my latest book that was came out not that long ago is a thinner, more focused book aimed at executives with limited time to read. And it's also out in an audiobook because some of these guys don't even have time to read, but they do drive in their car from time to time. So yeah, and I was very happy that Gary Hamel said yes to write the foreword for that book. So that's the short version of Beyond Budgeting. These are my contact details. If anybody wants to follow me on Twitter, LinkedIn, then that's highly appreciated. And I only write about this stuff. If you do follow me, you will know that there are no cats and dogs and grandchildren. Not at all, only Beyond Budgeting. This is the Beyond Budgeting Roundtable website. Have a look, and also my simple website as well. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing, and I look forward to your questions and comments. Thank you very much. You are muted, Michael.
Yeah, sometimes I start talking without actually unmuting. So thank you very much again. And yeah, I would now welcome everyone to ask the questions and put them in the chat. And or depending also on the size, we can actually maybe even open the floor to everyone. I know it's always difficult to be the first, so yeah, there's one. Rufat, please go ahead.
Thank you, Bjarte. Can you hear me? Hello?
Hello.
Yeah, you just go ahead.
Right. So coming back to the notion of control, in my experience, desire for control stems from expectations of shareholders and investors, not only the managers. And the shareholders would typically have auditors and boards, and they would like to see a control mechanism for their investments. And the best practice in corporate governance is the budgeting mechanism. So how do you educate investors and shareholders in an alternative? Do you have any experience in working with them beyond working with managers?
Well, first of all, most of the companies on that list are actually listed companies. That goes for Equinor as well, which is listed in New York and in Oslo. And my experience is that the markets, the investors, are not the big barrier here. I'm not saying that there are issues and challenges, but they are very often internal and sitting between our ears. And I recall again in Equinor, when we prepared to inform the market that we will stop giving kind of absolute financial guiding, but think in terms of football and league tables instead. Investor relations, they were very worried about the market response. And the market response was zero. Or the response we got is that, I mean, this is how we think all the time. Once we have decided to invest in energy, we benchmark you guys against all your competitors. So this is how we think. And we probably benchmark you on more stuff than you do yourself. So go ahead and prove it. Right. So my experience is that this is it's sometimes used as an excuse by some for not doing this, but if you really test it in practice, I mean, that is not the main issue and the main challenge. That's my experience.
Thank you very much. Thanks for the question, Rufat. Is there someone else? I see Matt typing something in the chat. So he loves the Roche example, and there seems to be a lot of traction in Europe. Do you want to elaborate on this, Matt?
Yeah, sorry, I just got a lot of background noise here. I'm a consultant, and I've worked with a lot of companies where there's some interest in beyond budgeting, but I guess I see more of it on the European side, and most of my clients right now are in the Americas, in the US, and I'm curious to be able to share examples with those companies about success stories of American companies implementing beyond budgeting.
I'm actually writing about this in my latest book, about the fact that the beyond budgeting is kind of more popular in Europe than in the US. That is correct. I mean, one reason could be that, I mean, most management stuff and management models is actually invented in the US. That does not go for beyond budgeting, right? So if you look at, I mean, the balanced scorecard, activity-based costing, and yeah, a lot of other stuff, it kind of invented in the US, and maybe it's harder to be critical to something that's coming from your own country. Beyond budgeting was invented or kind of emerged much more in Europe. But of course, there are some interesting cases. And since you're a consultant, what has happened just over the past few years is that almost all the big consulting firms have become seriously interested in beyond budgeting. And they want to work with us because their clients are interested. And we've had long discussions between ourselves. I mean, how should we respond? Because, I mean, we are not naive. I mean, we know that these big firms, they have their own agendas and we come from different places. But we have actually landed on saying yes, because we would rather work with these companies and especially their clients to help them succeed instead of standing on the outside and watching them fail. So some of the biggest companies we worked with has been through invitation from one of the big consulting firms. And personally, I've written 2 articles with Boston Consulting. You'll find that if you search BCG and beyond budgeting. So yeah, and of course that is something that I'm sure will start to resonate in the US as well. Because some executives, I mean, this is what I need to hear, that this stuff is good. And actually, BCG and also Bain and Company have done surveys on how clients and others perceive beyond budgeting and benefits. And that's very, very positive. Again, I'm writing about this in my book, but BCG have a long list of benefits that clients keep coming up with, and the biggest impact actually the companies are reporting is an increase in sales beyond previous budget ceilings, right? And I think I know why. If you have reached your sales budget in November, why on earth should you keep selling, right? That's one example. So I'm convinced that stuff will start to happen in the US as well. And again, there are, I mean, Gary Hamel, an American, wrote the foreword. Rita McGrath from the Columbia Business School has endorsed the book and so on. So there is definitely some traction, but yeah, we'll see.
Thanks for the question. Thanks for answering. Anyone else?
Alexander?
Alexander was there, yeah, fantastic.
Yeah, don't thank for your talk for the presentation. In the end, when you presented your book, you said something like, okay, there's a smaller version for the CEOs because they have less time. So isn't that already part of the misleading concept of how they see themselves? Like, I'm more important because I think I have less time, and so I'm the person who thinks to be in control of everything, and I take more responsibility. So what's your thoughts about that?
Well, I mean, you're probably right, but I'm quite. I mean, it is a fact that they think like that and they feel very busy, and I'm simply relating to that by kind of providing them and offering them a shorter read, which might trigger an interest then from reading more stuff. But it is a way to get started. That's how I was thinking.
Thank you.
Thanks for that. Thanks for that. Anyone else would like to?
Paulina?
Paulina, please.
Yes, I would like just to go further on the reason why starting the transformation, the cultural one, because this is the transformation of the culture. By the way, I love it. I'm an ex-CFO. I done a lot of budget, and I agree that it's not worth to do it. and just the reason why they read even the shorter version. What's the trigger? What's the point that is making them the leaders thinking about the change?
Well, I mean, what I hope to achieve is to get them to understand that the current management model, traditional management that they have, they think it's working, right? They think it's they think they are in control, and this is to kind of rock that assumption, to create them a bit uneasy about other problems here that I haven't thought about. That's kind of one thing about this. And the other thing is to kind of make them aware of all the other companies that out there that are starting on this journey, and so as to create a little bit of peer pressure. And actually, there's one industry where we have seen peer pressure now, and that's the pharmaceutical industry. We talked about Roche, who is seen in general as a kind of highly regarded, and they went beyond budgeting some years ago, and now Merck German Merck has done the same, and Bayer Pharmaceuticals have a new CEO, Bill Anderson, coming from Roche, and has been very vocal in Financial Times, for instance, about wanting to kick out stupidity and bureaucracy and budgets and whatever. Further, a Spanish pharmaceutical company, and others. So creating a bit of peer pressure. It's not my favorite kind of pulling point, because it's yeah, but I mean, if nothing else works, then and again, I'm also then, for some of these, when they see that the big consulting firms are talking positively about this, that might also be a trigger. But I think, again, the larger the organization is, the more likely it is that the CEO and CFO are not aware of how dysfunctional this model is, right? So it's a little bit like, you know, the fairy tale of Hans Christian Andersen with the Emperor's New Clothes. I mean, we need more boys raising their finger and shouting that the emperor is naked, right? And yeah.
Thanks for that. Thanks for Paulina. Yeah, I'm just wondering, is there, just to the audience, is there anything you could imagine it's easy to implement into your company? One of the principles, is it?
There's a question from Rainer.
Okay, great. Rainer, go ahead.
Okay, then you talked about decoupling, separating, you know, targets from forecasts and resource allocation, and I can absolutely understand how a target should be different from a forecast, and to some degree I can understand how a forecast should not completely determine resource allocation, particularly not, you know, many months or a year in advance. But I see a strong link between, you know, if I want to make a forecast, I need to know how many resources I have. Because if I find out the next day, you know, that I don't have any resources, then that forecast means nothing anymore. So what are your thoughts on this?
Well, first of all, there is one area where there's a clear link between forecasting and resource allocation, and that is for projects, right? Where you typically, again, back to Equinor, when that company is deciding to build an windmill farm or whatever, of course, they make a forecast of the expected cost, investment cost, the expected revenues, to calculate the so-called net present value. So in that sense, it's a link. But beyond that, I mean, you make a forecast by your starting point is your current cost base, so how many people and what kind of running cost do you have, and then you look to the future, and you look at what you think will happen, what you plan to do, and so on, and what are the expected consequences of this when it comes to financial numbers. So that is your forecast. It is because the main purpose of a forecast is decision making, to help you make better decisions, right? You try to understand what lies ahead. But there are companies who say, that, again, Handelsbanken, they make very few forecasts. Mr. Wallander, the CEO that I showed, he had a very pragmatic view. He said that, well, if you know what tomorrow look like, you don't need to make a forecast because you know what will happen. But if you don't know what tomorrow will look like, how can you make a forecast because you don't know what will happen? So this was his view. That wasn't, in any case, Anyway, I'm not saying that you shouldn't make forecasts, but I mean, they should be to help decision making and not be kind of mingled with all other stuff like bid into a target negotiation or an application for resources. Was that?
Thanks for that. Now,
Thank
Sven.
you.
Thank you.
Thanks. Yeah, you mentioned some bigger companies like Merck or Bayer, and that got me thinking that if you want to introduce it seems to me like it has to be a top-down approach somehow. So that probably the management needs to be a fan of beyond budgeting, I think.
Yeah, of course, at one stage, and they need to be fully on board. But we have a number of cases where it wasn't necessarily the kind of the case from the beginning, but finance were given a chance to try this out, and they actually realized that this is good stuff. The CEO of Equinor, he actually openly admitted when we proposed this almost 20 years ago that I don't fully understand all of this stuff, but I'm intrigued enough to give it a chance. And he became a big fan. But of course, it is bigger it's more challenging in big companies, and also it's almost more difficult to get rid of stupid stuff than not to implement it in the first place. And I often say that companies are born beyond budgeting, right? They are small, nimble, flexible, non-bureaucratic, and so on. But they want to grow, most of them. And in growing, they adopt all the traditional management processes. They look at the big companies, what they have, they listen to management consultants. And one day they wake up and realize that we have not only become big, we have also become slow and rigid and bureaucratic and sometimes quite sad places to work. So I see a parallel here to the aging process of man, because as we get older, we do lose a bit of that agility we had as teenagers, at least on the physical side, and maybe a bit up here as well. And I think I know what I'm talking about. And when it comes to man, we have no choice. Of course, we can live healthy and exercise, but in the end, age takes us all. But companies, they have a choice. It's written nowhere that because you are big, you should be slow and rigid and all the things that we don't want to be. So the big question for any big company should be, how can we find our way back to what we had as a smaller organization without losing the benefit of being big? So how can we be small and big at the same time? The big question for small companies is, how can we grow without ending up in the same misery? And it is possible if you are aware of it every day. And we have examples in our community of companies like that, started out small and they've been growing and have been very aware of it and not fall into that trap of traditional management. But you have to be very much aware of it.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. I like the bit that everyone is born, or every company is sort of born in beyond budgeting. So it's a bit like every human being is actually per se by birth a good human being, and then by socialization maybe develops to some other end. Yeah. Thank you very much. Thanks, Sven. Anyone else? Please.
Just, I'm wondering, in the process of adoption, implementation, and you can call it like you want, what are the first fruits that you can just gather to make it vivid in the company?
Do you mean what are the
first gains?
First benefits we are seeing? Well, I think what people, both managers and finance people, experience immediately is that it's much less work, and the work they do are much more meaningful, much forward-looking, much more business-oriented, much more continuous, and less stunts and all of that. But of course, it doesn't translate into bottom line financial performance improvements on day one. That will of course take somewhat longer, and it can again be hard to prove that this is because of beyond budgeting. Again, if we look to how Equinor has performed compared to other big energy firms, I mean, it's they have been doing extremely well, but it's hard to prove that it was because beyond budgeting. But beyond budgeting has certainly not hurt. And the fact that the company still operates like this after 20 years is a sign that this works, right? It wasn't the kind of a fad that, yeah, and I don't think you will find many managers and finance people or anyone else, if any, in the company wanting to go back, even if there was absolutely skeptical people up front, right?
Thanks for the question. There's one more in the chat with Sebastian. Do you want to come here on the screen?
Just on the topic of Bayer, there was just an article today in the Spiegel magazine where there are journalists talk about Bayer's and Bill Anderson's change project. I also shared a link to a podcast where he's being interviewed, and in that podcast there's a long interview that's going to come out this Saturday. So those interested in the Bayer case will find some more stuff. That was all I wanted to share.
Very good. Thank you very much.
Very good. And Sebastian is a colleague of mine in the Beyond Budgeting core team, by the way. So very happy to have him on board.
Yep.
I know.
Yeah, maybe I can ask another question. So you presented the principles and the processes, and it's a dozen. And I'm wondering, is there a good place to start? Maybe that follows up a bit on Paulina's question, because I would think it might start with transparency, but maybe you have different thoughts.
Because this is a question we get a lot, and I've got two advices on that. First, build a solid case for change. So make sure that there is a broadly and well understood case for change, that people understand why the organization is doing this, what kind of problems we are trying to solve, and what we need to move towards. Because then when you move into the design phase and you have to make choices, then you can go back to that case for change and the problems you identified. Which of these alternatives will best solve that case for change? So that's important. And beyond that, I will start with the separation of the budget purposes. And then having done that, you can create transparency around all three. I mean, the transparency around what kind of targets people have and units have. You can create transparency around the forecasts in the organization, and so on and so on. And also transparency on actual performance of different units. For instance, using these league tables. So how are different units performing compared to each other in a kind of friendly competition with strong focus on learning. But the separation is where most companies that's where most companies get started.
Thanks for that, Rainer. And so Rufat and or Diana, I'm not quite sure who was first.
Come on, Diana.
It was Rufat.
Okay.
Go ahead,
Yes.
please.
All right. In many companies, budgeting is a part of a larger performance management process, which implements things like the balanced scorecard and OKRs and stuff like that. So my question is beyond budgeting just beyond budgeting part of performance management only, or it's beyond non-financial measurement and performance management as well? And how do you also apply this principle of separating target setting from forecasting, from resource allocation in non-financial measurement as well?
Yes, you can do it, for instance, on production, where you have a production target that is more ambitious than your production forecast, as one example. And since you mentioned the balanced scorecard, then back to Equinor. That company was an early mover on balanced scorecards, and so was Borealis. Borealis is actually in the balanced scorecard Hall of Fame, or was that worth? But anyway, go back to Equinor then. The company had for many years both balanced scorecards and budgets. And very often there was a conflict between what the balanced scorecard told you to do, and what the budget told you to do. And in that conflict, the budget was always winning, right? So the company had balanced scorecard, but the implicit or explicit message was that it's really the budget that counts. And when we kicked out the budget, that balanced scorecard competition, and put that balanced scorecard as the cornerstone in the management process, we renamed it Ambition to Action, and also designed it heavily influenced by the Beyond Budgeting philosophy. Then that kind of turbocharged the whole concept, because it became very clear to the organization, this is what now counts, because this is the only thing we have. And the same advice I would have for OKRs, because very often you have OKRs, you have budgets, conflict between the two, guess who is winning? So if you want to be successful with the OKRs, well, do something with the competition, right? And also what we see so often is that when new management concepts are introduced, it's about putting new management boxes on top of old management boxes. Nothing is kind of kicked out, but just on top. And that is also not very efficient. That also creates bureaucracy. So this is very much about not just introducing new stuff, but also kicking out old stuff.
Thank you very much for the question, Rufat. According to the time box, we have 4 more minutes left. Diana, if you would just want to give a quick question, and after the time box ended, the large time box, we can just stay in the room and ask more questions. But
okay, I will try to be quick.
A quick one.
I understand the principles and I can follow them, and I love the principles. But what is of my interest to find out, when you implement changes in those companies, how do you make the people understand what is the new reality looking alike? Because they are used to work in a specific way for decades, and then such a change comes, and how open they are to believe that there is something new which has more transparency and trustfulness.
Well, first of all, it's back to this case for change, that be very clear about why the company is doing this. And for instance, I mean, by be open, saying that we do trust people. We don't think the future is predictable and plannable, and that must have implications for how we lead and manage. And then the only way to kind of let people get experience in this is to get started. And you will have scared managers, scared finance people in the beginning, but very quickly people see that this actually works. One fact is that very few companies go back once they have started, right? Because this works. On the contrary, they typically get braver along the way, even if it might feel scary in the beginning. So, and that is how you, over time, change thinking, by people seeing that this works.